Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Breaking Point podcast. Today we are here with Connie Shaw. Connie is the host of the Fringe Podcast. Connie, you describe yourself as anti-woke feminist. So what is an anti-woke feminist?
Well, I describe myself as that, but I'm still trying to decipher what that actually means. And I've spoken before about how I do find it quite difficult sometimes to reconcile being anti-woke and being a feminist, because lots of people who are anti-woke consider feminism to be woke. But I would say currently to be an anti-woke feminist, it mainly means believing in the sex-based rights of women and not believing in gender. So being a gender-critical feminist or a sex realist feminist would be and being an anti-woke feminist. In general, I would say I'm pretty anti-woke in the sense that I think it's quite damaging to build a society based on how many oppression points collective groups have, which in itself seems contradictory to the idea that feminism is trying to fight against the oppression of women. One thing that winds me up about some feminist narratives is that the idea that women in the UK or in the West in general are systematically oppressed. I don't believe that. I believe there is sexism, but I don't believe we are systematically oppressed in the same way that women living under the Taliban. If we call ourselves oppressed, then we don't have another word to refer to women living under horrific regimes. So in that sense, I would say I'm an anti-woke feminist because I don't want to paint myself as a victim as a woman, but I'm still able to recognise that there are serious things that we need to overcome when it comes to the way that women are treated because of their sex. And I would say at the moment the biggest hurdle to it is gender ideology in the West. And so in that way, because gender ideology is woke, I consider myself an anti-woke feminist.
Just going on the feminist point, it's really interesting you bring that up because it's something that rattles around my head quite a lot. The statistics on how much better young women are doing than young men are just staggering. And the fact that more people don't know about it. If you look at basically every single aspect of life, you find that young women are doing better than young men. They earn more, they're better educated, they have more friends, they have more sex, they have better relationships. Now, 80% of people that kill themselves are men, 90% of people that die whilst working are men, 75% of homeless people are men. The list just goes on and on and on. And one of the things that baffles me, and I think really gets under my skin, is how as a society we don't view suicidality rates as a view of who is struggling, and how the term oppression has many terms actually. If you look at all the isms, you can see that what racism, sexism and all those things, all the, what are they? What's the word? Begins with a discriminatory sort of terms. If you look at their definition 20, 30 years ago, what they mean now is almost so far separated from what they originally meant that you almost can't even consider them to be the same terms because they don't really mean the same thing. Maybe the crux is there, but the petals or whatever, so to speak, the outskirts have completely changed shape, form, colour and everything. So what when I was watching another podcast that you were on and you were speaking about how you were once a sort of pro. Well, let's get into what happened, what you're doing now and what happened with you at university and what it is that you did to end up in the situation that you're in.
Yeah, so I was elected as the daytime editor at Leeds Student Radio, also known as LSR, and I started that position at the start of this academic year in September. And at the same time, I started my own podcast, which I purposely made separate from LSR because I knew that they probably would not want to be platforming my beliefs, such as the fact that I was gender critical. And part why this is so relevant to my role as the daytime editor is that I was overseeing all of the talk shows on LSR, and there are 5 talk shows, and they include Politics Hour, Women's Hour, and LGBTQ Hour, as well as 2 others. And so the fact that I was talking about gender ideology on my podcast from a gender critical perspective meant that there was a lot of backlash from students. And the second episode that I did was an interview with a detransitioner, Charlie Bentley Astor, and that got quite a lot of backlash. And the person who helped me edit that podcast, because he put so much time into helping me edit, I credited him in a caption, and he received an official warning from a separate society and was told that he must distance himself from me and my work, and if he didn't, further measures would be taken. So at that point, I purchased my Free Speech Union membership just in case, because clearly if that can happen to someone who helped me edit, then someone at some point is probably going to come for me who actually made the podcast. And then I continued with the podcast. I did a couple of other episodes. LSR went to the Battle of Ideas on media passes, and the Battle of Ideas is a freedom of speech festival, and we advertised the event as a station. We did a ticket giveaway, and at that event we'd secured interviews as LSR through the organisers, but I'd also personally secured interviews with Andrew Gold and Graham Linehan. And the day that I published the Graham Linehan episode was the 28th of October. And then the following day, Graham published an article that I wrote for his Substack in which I was describing how gender ideology has captured the University of Leeds. And then the day after that, on the 30th of October, I received an email telling me that I'd been suspended from my committee position and as a member of LSR, and that I was being investigated by the student union as a result of my social media, Substack and media production. And I was accused of putting the health and safety of other members at risk, of not acting in a duty of care. And so that investigation went on for a month, and I went to an interview, and they told me that the investigation was not about my right to hold and say gender critical views, but they then asked me, how do you maintain an inclusive environment at LSR, considering your choice to publicly post your views makes some people feel unincluded?
It's a big problem.
So on one hand, I was told it wasn't about my views, but then I was asked a question directly about my views and how that impacts other people. The outcome of the investigation was that the allegations of misconduct were dropped, but there is another allegation that I had brought LSR into disrepute, and they maintained that allegation, and that is the basis on which they removed me from my committee position. And they said that I could still return as a member, but if I wanted to run for committee again next year, I would have to write a written apology to the wider membership and take mandatory training in online conduct. And so the Free Speech Union is helping me with my appeal, and that's where I stand now, that that decision is now in the process of an appeal.
There's two things that sort of poke their heads out at me, given what you just said and obviously your whole sort of story. One is, as a society and as a language, the parlance of the word gender needs to be abolished. It doesn't add, the idea that gender is a construct is actually true. By definition, it's a construct. It was made up by a person, I think his name was Dr. Mooney, who I don't know the story verbatim, so I almost don't want to quote it, but you should go and look it up, because it's an awful story. And what gender basically is personality to some degree. So there's spectrums or distributions of personality, and there's a bell curve for the sexes, and there's a bulk where most men end up here and most women end up here or whatever, but there's always going to be outliers, and the likelihood that there's potentially a likelihood that the personality traits that or women are more likely to land on the high end of the distribution, there's a likelihood that as a biological woman you may end up on the lower or vice versa, and you may end up on the lower on multiple ones. And you may have a personality, as we've all known, that is not very stereotypically feminine. The word stereotype is correct, because as humans, we need stereotypes because we actually need to fit things into boxes, because if we don't fit something into a box, we actually can't really compute it, and we're surrounded by chaos. And all this links in. So that's the first thing. Gender needs to be abolished, and we need to just look at people as... And I almost think this is one that's so ironic about leftist ideology is that, and when you mentioned identity politics, is we've actually just moved, they've taken stereotypical right-wing tendencies and twisted them, and they've come back out the other end, and they've overlaid them onto different aspects. So now you fit into this category. But I thought the whole point of progression was to move away from categories, but now we're putting you into this category. So you're a white, straight, cisgendered, heterosexual male. That's your demographic. That's what we judge you based on. People with progressive values tend to be creative. It's a hallmark of being progressive, but they're willing to put you into a category. So it's very interesting, that whole thing. And the second thing that comes out is the cancel culture that is basically almost entirely a product of the left is very interesting. You don't really find people on the right cancelling people on the left. I don't know if that's ever really happened. I'm sure it has. I'm sure there are examples, but the vitriol and the vexatiousness behind what's happened to you and what's happened to people you've spoken to is another really interesting thing. So why do you think the left has become is willing to demonize people more than vice versa?
I think it's interesting you saying how it's mainly people on the right who get cancelled by the left, because as much as I think that is true, I think the worst cancellations happen to the people who are on the left, who don't go along with everything that the left believes in. So people like Graham Linehan, he is left-wing, and J.K. Rowling is left-wing. Rosie Duffield was a MP for the Labour Party. But because they don't go along with gender ideology, they have been they have suffered the most from the cancellation idea, because they're seen as outcasts from a cult. Whereas people who are always on the right, for example, Matt Walsh, it's almost like, to be fair, maybe maybe he was cancelled in a way, but it's not the same because he already had his own tribe, whereas he wasn't saying anything out of the ordinary. He was already a conservative. I come from gender ideology from a different perspective to him. He sees it more in the sense that I think he does believe there are certain roles that women are more suited to.
Yeah, I'm a fan of the Daily Wire platform and all those people associated with it.
I agree with that to an extent. I do think the fact that I do think women are more likely to be nurturing and have a maternal nature. I think some of that is rooted in biology, but I think that he will see that a lot more sort of I do, and I come at it from a feminist perspective. So for him, it wasn't experienced the same backlash in the same way that Graham has, for example, because like you said, to be progressive often goes hand in hand with being in the arts. And so he was in that, and the same with J.K. Rowling, the same with Jenny Lindsay. So it's who are sort of leaving the cult. I mean, with Charlie Bentley Astor, she was in theatre, and when she detransitioned, she was effectively outcast from her peers.
That's really awful. That is one that gets you, isn't it? Someone who is coming from the horse's mouth, isn't it? And that is the greatest indication of a blind obedience to something, because that's not genuine compassion. And that's so. Just going back to what was I going to say? You were speaking about Matt Walsh. So do you not think that women being more nurturing is biological?
I do to an extent, yeah. But I don't. I think maybe I'm unfairly painting his views on this. I would imagine that he, more so than me, would be in favour, and I'm not saying he is actually in favour of this, but I think he would be more sympathetic to the idea that really a woman's place is in the home. I'm not saying to say that, but I think he would be more sympathetic to, in an ideal society, mothers would be homemakers and child rearers, and whereas it doesn't really, maybe an ideal society, but I don't think that's a fair society.
Yeah, no. If I was to steel man the anti-patriarchal viewpoint, I would say that narcissists find a way in under the little slit in the membrane to get underneath, and then they cause the damage underneath. So I would say, if you look at really interesting sort of case study is Hugh Hefner, when he was trying to push his Playboy, he came out with all the rhetoric of, I think women allowing them to be photos taken of them, etc., in a provocative manner is actually really liberating for them, and it's pro-feminism, and basically, and then what came out, which is obvious, what came out when he died is that he was an awful person, didn't care about anyone but himself. And that's what narcissistic people do. They find their way in, and they exploit it, and then the same thing happened with cigarettes. I think the guy that either was the biggest owner of the largest cigarette company, or even the guy that invented cigarettes, found when the suffragette movement was taking place, he saw a sort of a gap in the market where he thought, I can just make more money out of people by saying that smoking's for everyone, or women can smoke or something. So the point I'm trying to make is that someone like Matt Walsh, not that I'm not him particular, but that sort of, if I was to take a stance, what I believe is the most sophisticated stance on the left would be that narcissists are sort of tied myself in knots here. What am I trying to say? They would their own agenda. They further their own agenda by playing on the prevailing ethic or even the counter ethic, so that they can paint themselves as if they're the vanguard and they're fighting for the oppressed and all that. And I think that's my problem with the whole sort of the Matt Walsh Daily Wire. I can't work out if you're genuine or if you're just taking a position to further your own agenda. And there's many people that are doing that, and that's one of the
Same thing over and over again. Students at Leeds repeatedly call me a grifter and that I love negative attention. I love spreading negativity and hate for the sake of it because I'm a narcissist. I've been accused of being a narcissist.
And it is a great it's a buzzword at the moment, isn't it? So, and I just used it as well. It's a bit of a trope. Would you say your temperament is, because you strike me as quite a disagreeable person at heart, and that's not a bad thing, by the way. I'm an agreeable person, and it's a fucking pain in the arse a lot of the time. So, what do you agree with that, or do you think I've got that completely wrong?
I guess to lots of people I'd be a disagreeable person, but I get what you mean. I probably wouldn't use the term disagreeable. I just think even looking back at reports, my school reports from primary school and then into secondary school, more than once, different teachers who have never met each other have described me as having a strong sense of justice, which I don't like. That we're all having like a moral compass. And at school, I was a snitch and I felt like I had a duty to like call out what was wrong. Things have happened in my life which have made me I can't think of a better word, but basically stubborn and very sure in what I think is right and wrong.
Ironically.
But I don't think is that I'm very open to changing my mind, in the sense that when I was at school, I believed that trans women were women, and to think otherwise was hateful. And changed my mind. So I'm very open to, I'm desperate to have debates about things. And that's what's so annoying about the student reaction to my work, is that they keep saying that all I'm interested in is showing how I'm right.
Yeah.
Which, to an extent, of course, isn't everyone, aren't they? They're the ones who've kicked me out of the Facebook group, which kind of... Yeah. I've people like, well, please come and speak to me. I want to be challenged.
They won't.
But it's like, if they really think that what I'm doing is that wrong, surely they'd want to challenge me. That's the whole reason why I challenge gender ideology, because I think it's wrong and harmful.
Well, it goes back to the whole category thing that I was bringing up earlier. It's easier to just put you in the box of devil, and we don't touch the box of devil. And anyone that even entertains the box of devil or flirts with the box of devil is therefore a bad person. So we can't go near you. One of the things that I do find exceptionally interesting, and I've done quite a bit of research into it, is this idea that for many reasons, women are far more politically correct than men. And I've asked various, spoken about it, and anecdotally, I do find that is the case, and I think it's really, really. Did you know that women used to be far more conservative than men politically?
I didn't know that.
Apparently, yeah, until I think it maybe was like the 2000s, but maybe I've got that completely wrong. But what that is, I would say, well, it was because they were under the of patriarchy and they needed to be dispelled, and they were dispelled, and now they see the truth and all that, and maybe there's some truth to that. But I think that, well, if I'm more agreeable temperamentally, then it makes sense that they're going to be more politically correct, because they want to toe the party, that they don't want to cause uproar. They want to keep the peace, and that makes sense. But I also think there's a respect for authority that women have more than men sometimes. And I wonder if that's got something to do with hypergamy and their tendency to look up from a dating and mating point of view. I don't know. There's not a lot of there's a bit of research done into it, obviously, but there's not loads of research done into it, probably for obvious reasons. But why do you think, if that is the case, why could that be?
Well, I can only speak from my own experience.
That's
but
fine.
I feel like I used to be like, and from my experience of talking and being in seminars with other girls my age at university, there's a fear to disagree. And I think it's because girls are, for some reason, they're interested in being kind and empathetic. And when things like that's happened to me, happens, that's not going to encourage more women to speak out. Although I have had many messages from young women saying, thank you so much for talking about it. I wish I could talk about it, but I can't. So it's nice to see someone my age doing it. So they're saying to me privately that they wish they could talk about it, but they can't publicly. And so I actually have no idea how many girls at uni agree with me, because if they do, they're keeping very quiet. And I can imagine in seminars when I'm saying something that is making nearly everyone look at me in a really suspicious way, that when others see that happening, they're thinking, well, I don't want to start agreeing with Connie because I don't want to be looked at or spoken to in the way that she is. So it's almost impossible to know. Maybe it's just the vocal minority, possibly, that are happy to speak out. I think there are far more women who don't believe in it than do. I think it's only young women as well. I think very few older women believe in this.
Yeah. Well, a really interesting thing is that if you look at something like the phenomenon of MPI, which is a mass psychogenic illness, you find that the most that are most susceptible to being swept up in a mass psychogenic illness are young women. You look, and throughout history that's been the case. You look at something like the Harlem witch trials. There's no evidence for this, but whatever went on there would have been an example of an MPI. Something happened, then it just spread through the young women of the group. You look at something like eating disorders, you find that eating disorders spread in friendship groups through each other. You find there been some ridiculous MPIs.
It was the same with self-harm as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Just another one. Like, we had a whole
Cutting.
There was a friendship group where nearly all of them had an identity. Like, one friend saying to me, it's almost like they had said to each other, oh, just say you're this. Like, it's fun. But I was aside whether it was because naturally people who want to become friends with others who can relate, or is it like it's chicken and egg? Did they become friends with each other, or were they already friends? One person comes out of something. And I'm not saying that they were faking it or whatever, but it was strange that nearly all of them in this one friendship group seemed to have a really specific sexuality or a gender identity.
Yeah.
And not to say that there weren't other people in other friendship groups who didn't, but they all seem to group together. And yeah, it's very obvious. And there needs to be more research into why this is something that girls do. But you're completely right. And that's why it's so obvious that this is just the next social contagion. And if this is the current one, then it's quite scary to think what it could be in the future.
Yeah. Well, so I think sorry to interrupt you. Were you going to say something else?
I was going to say just in like suicidality is another one.
Yeah. Yes, of course. God. So you were saying, you just said, why is this? And immediate reaction is because